There is a kind of leaving that makes no sound, no slam door, no final speech rehearsed in a bathroom mirror at 3 in the morning, no tears performed for an audience that never watched closely enough to deserve them. Just an absence, sudden, complete, and impossible to argue with. And it is precisely this silence, this refusal to explain, that becomes the most devastating thing a wounded person can do to the one who wounded them. Before this goes further, if what follows feels like it is describing something you have lived, press like now and subscribe, because what is coming will name things about your own departure that you have never had language for. Carl Jung once wrote that the most terrifying thing a person can do is accept themselves completely. But there is a second terror, quieter, rarely spoken of, the terror of being fully known by someone and then losing them, not through anger, but through their calm and total withdrawal. This is not abandonment. This is judgment, delivered without a single word, and it is the only judgment some people are incapable of surviving with their self-image intact. You know this leaving, perhaps you have already lived it, the version where you gave and gave, absorbed the moods of a room before anyone spoke a word, felt another person's pain arrive in your own chest before they had even admitted it to themselves. And one day, without drama, without a scene, you simply were no longer there. Not because you stopped caring, because caring had finally, mercifully, run its course, and the person who lost you did not understand, for a long time, that your silence was not empty, it was full, of everything they never let you say. This is the story of that departure, not as an act of coldness, but as the final stage of a psychological process Carl Jung spent his life trying to name, a process older than any single relationship, older than any single wound, written into the architecture of the human soul long before either of you were born. You are not being told a story about someone else tonight. You are being shown the shape of your own becoming. To understand why the quiet exit devastates more than rage ever could, you must first understand what an empath actually is within Jung's own map of the psyche, not as a mystical label borrowed loosely from spiritual language, but as a specific configuration of the 4 functions through which every human mind orients itself to reality. Jung identified thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition as the primary tools of consciousness, and observed that most people develop 1, perhaps 2, allowing the others to remain undeveloped, shadowed, unconscious, waiting in the dark for a crisis to summon them forward. But there exists a rarer configuration, the dominant feeling type fused with a porous, absorbent intuition, where the boundary separating self from other becomes thin, almost negligible, almost non-existent in moments of closeness. Jung had a term for this condition, though he applied it more broadly than modern language allows: participation mystique, a primitive, pre-rational fusion between subject and object, in which a person does not simply witness another's suffering from a safe interior distance, but participates in it directly, absorbs it into the body, becomes temporarily inhabited by an emotional weather system that did not originate within them. This is not weakness. This is not, as modern vocabulary likes to flatten it, mere sensitivity. It is a specific psychic structure, and like every structure Jung studied across 4 decades of clinical work, it carries both a gift and a wound, sewn into the very same fabric, inseparable, indivisible, impossible to have one without eventually paying for the other. The gift is this: such a person can sense truth beneath performance. They know, often before the performer even knows it themselves, when a smile is covering grief, when confidence is covering fear, when a declaration of love is covering a vast, echoing absence where love should be. They read the unconscious material leaking out from behind another person's persona, that curated mask Jung described as a segment of the collective psyche worn to navigate the social world, but so often mistaken by its wearer for the self entirely, worn so long and so convincingly that the wearer forgets there was ever a face beneath it. The wound is this: Because the empath perceives what others hide even from themselves, they become a mirror, too accurate to be comfortable. And people, most people, wounded people, defended people, do not want an accurate mirror, they want a flattering one. They want witnesses who will collude quietly in the persona's performance, not psychologists who will expose it simply by existing nearby, simply by feeling too clearly, simply by refusing, even unconsciously, to look away from what is real. This is where the relationship begins to rot, not with cruelty, not at first, with mismatch, with one person offering their unguarded interior and the other person receiving it as raw material for their own self-flattery. Now picture the particular relationship this hour is speaking to, the one where the empath gave endlessly to someone who took the giving as confirmation of their own persona. I am loved, therefore I am good. I am accommodated, therefore I am right. I am forgiven, therefore whatever I did could not have been so serious after all. Each act of the empath's patience became, unconsciously, evidence in the other person's favor. Every silence the empath swallowed to preserve the peace was misread, not as sacrifice, but as permission. Every tear cried alone, away from view, was proof to the other person that nothing catastrophic had actually occurred, because catastrophe, surely, would have made more noise. Jung wrote that everything which irritates us about others can lead us to a deeper understanding of ourselves. But irritation requires reflection, and reflection requires a mirror willing to hold still long enough to be truly looked into. For years, sometimes for a lifetime, the empath was that mirror. They absorbed the moods, they softened the conflicts before they could ignite. They translated the other person's unspoken resentments into forgivable, palatable language, again and again, patiently, exhaustingly, until their own needs became a rumor, even to themselves, a story they half remembered having once wanted to tell, before they decided, quietly, that it was safer not to. And this is the part almost no one names correctly, the part that separates a documentary from a diagnosis. The empath's exit is not born on the day they finally leave. It is born far earlier, in the slow accumulation of 1,000 small erasures, moments where their own reality was quietly overridden in service of someone else's comfort, someone else's narrative, someone else's need to remain, in their own eyes, blameless. Jung called the disowned, unacknowledged parts of the self the shadow, everything a person refuses to see in themselves, pushed downward into darkness, still alive there, still exerting its pressure on behavior from below the threshold of awareness. But there is a subtler shadow at work in the empath's own psyche as well, one rarely discussed even in depth psychology circles, the shadow of self-abandonment. The parts of the empath's own needs, their own boundaries, their own unspoken truths, pushed into darkness, not only by the other person's blindness, but by the empath's own repeated decision, made silently, over and over, across months and years, that peace mattered more than voice. This is not a story of a villain and a victim. Jung's psychology has no patience for such simple architecture. It is a story of two unconscious patterns meeting, recognizing something useful in each other, and building an entire relationship on that recognition without either party ever fully understanding what they had agreed to. Enantiodromia, Jung's term for the psychological law stating that any position pushed to its extreme eventually reverses into its opposite, is the mechanism that explains what happens next, and it is worth sitting with this word for a moment, because it explains more about human transformation than almost any other concept in the Jungian canon. A person who gives without limit does not simply give forever. There is no infinite reservoir, at some invisible threshold, crossed so quietly that even the person crossing it does not notice the exact moment. The pattern reverses entirely. The very capacity for boundless empathy converts, without warning, into boundless distance. Not hatred, distance. The two are not opposites, though they are often confused for one another. Hatred still requires contact, still requires the fire of continued attachment. Distance is what remains after the nervous system finally, mercifully, refuses to keep translating pain into patience, after the body itself withdraws its consent to keep performing endurance. This is why the exit, when it finally arrives, is silent. It is not new information for the empath, it is old information, held for years in the body, finally, fully believed. There is a dream image that recurs, almost uncannily, among people who have lived through this particular kind of departure, reported independently, in wildly different lives, described in strikingly similar terms, as though drawn up from the same well of the collective unconscious that Jung spent his career mapping. In the dreamer stands inside a house they have lived in for years. Every room is familiar down to the smallest detail, the placement of furniture, the quality of light through a particular window at a particular hour. But when the dreamer tries to speak, no sound leaves their mouth. They move from room to room, opening doors, gesturing with increasing urgency, trying desperately to be heard by someone standing just on the other side of a window pane. And the person on the other side smiles, waves cheerfully, mistakes the dreamer's silence for contentment, mistakes the frantic gesturing for a friendly greeting. Jung would read this dream with characteristic precision. The house is the psyche itself, long inhabited, over-familiar, containing rooms the dreamer has not consciously visited in years. The voicelessness is not literal muteness. It is the terrible, accumulated experience of a person whose truth has gone unheard for so long that even the unconscious no longer bothers rehearsing it as speech, has given up on language altogether as a viable tool for being understood. The window is the persona itself, the glass through which the other person continues to see only what they wish to see, comfortable, undisturbed, entirely oblivious to the collapse, occurring mere inches away from them, separated only by a thin pane that might as well be an ocean. And then, in the versions of this dream reported most consistently across different dreamers, something shifts. The dreamer stops trying to speak. They simply turn away from the window, walk toward a door at the back of the house, one they had somehow never noticed before, in all their years of living there, and step outside into a landscape that is unfamiliar, vast, quiet, and entirely their own. There is no anguish in this final image. There is something closer to relief. The particular relief of a burden, finally set down after being carried so long, the arms had forgotten what lightness felt like. This is the unconscious, rehearsing the exit, long before the conscious mind receives permission to enact it in waking life. Long before the empath physically leaves, the psyche has already been leaving in dream, night after night, walking toward that unfamiliar door, preparing the self for a departure the ego is still too loyal, too frightened, or too kind to consciously choose. If you have had this dream, or one like it, understand what it was doing. It was not warning you. It was preparing you. It was rehearsing, in the safety of sleep, a courage your waking self was not yet ready to hold. What awakens in a person, after they finally walk through that door, has a name in Jungian thought, though it is rarely applied to this particular story, rarely spoken of in relation to something as ordinary sounding as leaving a relationship. It is the archetype of the wounded healer, Chiron, the centaur of Greek myth who carried an incurable wound in his own body, and precisely because of that wound, became the healer others sought out in their own suffering, trusted more deeply than any healer who had never bled. Jung saw in this myth a description of a very real psychological transformation, one he witnessed again and again in his consulting room. The wound does not disqualify a person from healing others. It qualifies them. It becomes the doorway through which their compassion, once naive and boundless and given away indiscriminately to anyone who reached for it, matures into something discerning, no longer offered to every hand that asks, but reserved now for the places where it will not simply be devoured and forgotten. This is the archetype awakening in the empath's silence, not coldness, discernment, hard won, born directly from injury. The The quiet exit is not the absence of the wounded healer's compassion. It is its maturation, its coming of age. The empath who leaves without a scene has not stopped feeling deeply. They have stopped performing their feeling for an audience that never earned the performance, never once asked what it cost. And here is the truth that makes this particular departure feel, to the one left behind, like the cruelest possible sentence ever passed without a single word spoken in court. Rage would have been a form of continued attachment. Rage says, "You still matter enough to hurt me visibly. You still occupy space in my nervous system. You can still reach me." Silence says something far more final. You no longer have access to the part of me that used to explain itself to you, that used to translate my pain into language soft enough for you to hear without discomfort. The narcissistic structure, so dependent on reaction, so fed continuously by conflict, drama, cycles of rupture and reconciliation, finds absolutely no fuel in silence. There is nothing left to argue with. There is nothing left to seduce back into the old pattern. There is only absence, total and self-contained, and in that absence, the person left behind is forced, perhaps for the very first time in the entire relationship, to sit alone with the unfiltered, unmediated truth of who they have actually been, without the empath there any longer to soften the reflection. This is the sentence at the center of everything this hour has been building toward, the line worth returning to long after this video ends. The empath's silence is not an empty room. It is a mirror turned permanently away, and there is no punishment more absolute than being denied your own reflection. Let us slow down here, because this deserves more than a single passing sentence. Consider what it actually means, psychologically, to be denied a mirror you have relied upon without ever acknowledging your reliance. For however long the relationship lasted, the empath performed an invisible function that the other person almost certainly never named, perhaps never even consciously recognized. They absorbed the unacceptable parts of the other person's behavior and returned them, transformed into something survivable. A moment of cruelty would occur, and the empath would find a way to understand it, to contextualize it, to hold it without shattering, and in doing so, they would hand back to the other person a version of themselves that could still be lived with. This is an extraordinary labor. It is, in its own way, a form of psychological alchemy, taking lead and returning gold, taking harm and returning forgiveness, taking absence and returning patience. When the empath leaves, that alchemical function leaves with them. The other person is left holding their own unprocessed lead, their own unmetabolized cruelty, with no one left to transform it into something bearable. This is why the silence lands as revenge. Even though revenge was never its intention, it was never designed as punishment. It was simply the empath, finally, keeping their own alchemy for themselves. Jung wrote extensively about the anima and the animus, the contrasexual inner figures that mediate a person's relationship to the unconscious, to feeling, to soul itself. In relationships marked by this particular dynamic, the empath often becomes, without ever agreeing to the role, an external stand-in for the other person's own undeveloped inner feminine or inner masculine, whichever function of soul connection the other person has failed to cultivate within themselves. The empath does the feeling that the other person cannot do for themselves. The empath holds the tenderness the other person has exiled from their own personality, often decades earlier, often for reasons buried so deep in their own history that they can no longer trace the original wound. This is a heavy thing to carry, and it explains why the exit, when it finally happens, feels to the one left behind like something closer to amputation than heartbreak. They are not merely losing a partner, they are losing the only functioning access point they had to their own interior life. No wonder the silence feels unbearable to them. No wonder they call it cruel. They have mistaken another person's soul for their own, and now that mistake has walked out the door, taking with it the only warmth the relationship ever generated. But this is where the story must turn toward the empath again, because this hour was never meant to dwell only in the wreckage left behind. It was meant to walk with you, the one who left, through what comes after, because leaving is not the end of the story, it is only the threshold. There is a concept in Jung's work, borrowed from anthropology but transformed entirely under his hand, called the threshold guardian, a figure, sometimes literal in myth, sometimes entirely internal, that stands at the boundary between one stage of psychological development and the next, testing whether the traveler is truly ready to cross. In fairy tales, this guardian appears as a dragon, a sphinx, a locked gate demanding a riddle correctly answered. In the empath's own psyche, this guardian often appears as guilt, a persistent, nagging voice insisting that leaving quietly was somehow a betrayal, that a better person would have stayed and explained, would have fought for understanding, would have given one more chance, one more conversation, one more attempt at being heard by someone who had already proven, 100 times over, incapable of hearing. This guilt is not a sign that the departure was wrong. It is the guardian standing at the threshold, and its presence confirms that a genuine crossing is underway. Nothing sacred is ever crossed without resistance. If leaving felt easy, it would not be individuation. It would simply be indifference, and indifference was never the empath's condition. Indifference is not what silence like this is built from. It is built from exhaustion so total, it finally became its own form of clarity. Jung described individuation as the lifelong process by which a person becomes who they were always, at some deep and often obscured level, meant to become, a process that requires the conscious realization and assimilation of everything the psyche has kept hidden, including, crucially, its own limits. This is worth repeating slowly. Individuation requires knowing your limits, not transcending them. For years, the empath may have believed that their calling was limitless giving, that their worth was measured by how much they could absorb without breaking. The quiet exit is the moment this belief finally, fully, dies, and something more honest is born in its place. There is a name Jung gave to this kind of death and rebirth, borrowed from religious language, but applied with clinical precision to ordinary psychological experience, the twice-born. Not everyone undergoes a second birth. Many people live and die having only ever been born once, biologically, and having built their entire identity on the foundations laid down in childhood, without ever questioning them, without ever being forced by circumstance to ask who they might be beneath the roles assigned to them. But some people, usually those who have suffered enough to have no other option, undergo a second birth entirely. They die to an old identity, one shaped by service, by accommodation, by the belief that their value lay in what they could offer others, and they are reborn into a self that is no longer negotiable, no longer available for erosion, no longer willing to disappear quietly into someone else's comfort. If you left quietly, understand what you actually did. You did not fail to fight for the relationship. You succeeded, finally, in fighting for yourself, using the only weapon that pattern of relationship could never counter, your own absence. Let us return, for a moment, to the alchemical language that Jung borrowed so extensively from medieval texts to describe the process of psychological transformation, because it maps with uncanny precision onto exactly what you have lived. The alchemists described 3 stages in the transformation of base matter into gold, and Jung recognized in these stages a perfect metaphor for the transformation of the human soul through suffering. The first stage, Nigredo, the blackening, describes a period of decay, confusion, and apparent ruin, the phase in which everything that once seemed solid dissolves, in which the old form of the self must die before anything new can take shape. If the years you spent giving endlessly to someone incapable of truly receiving it felt like a slow blackening, like something in you was quietly dying beneath the surface of ordinary days, you were not imagining it. You were living the Nigredo, whether you had language for it or not. The second stage, Albedo, the whitening, describes the dawning of clarity after the darkness, the moment when the ash of the old self begins to reveal something purer beneath it, when the fog lifts just enough to see clearly for the first time in years. This is the stage in which the empath, often quite suddenly, without any external trigger they can point to, simply stops explaining, stops absorbing, stops translating cruelty into forgivable language. The albedo is not a decision made in anger. It is a clarity that arrives after enough blackening has finally run its full course. The third stage, Rubedo, the reddening, describes the emergence of something whole, something alive, something capable of engaging with the world again, but from an entirely different foundation than before. This is what waits on the other side of the door in that recurring dream, not emptiness, not permanent isolation, but a landscape unfamiliar, precisely because it has never before been touched by the old pattern. The Rubedo is not the absence of relationship, it is the possibility of relationship, built on a self that no longer disappears to maintain it. If you are hearing this and recognizing your own life inside it, somewhere within this alchemical sequence right now, perhaps still in the blackening, still grieving a silence you chose, but did not entirely want to have to choose. Perhaps in the whitening, feeling the strange, guilty lightness of a room, finally quiet in a way that no longer aches. Perhaps already stepping, tentatively, into the reddening, testing whether it is possible to care for another person again without vanishing into the caring itself. Wherever you are, understand that this sequence cannot be rushed, and it cannot be skipped. The alchemists knew this. The gold does not appear before the blackening has finished its work. There is one more piece of this story that must be told before it closes, because it is the piece most often left out entirely, the piece that separates genuine psychological insight from cheap comfort. The quiet exit, however necessary, however earned, is not without its own cost to the one who performs it. Jung was clear that the shadow cannot simply be projected outward forever, that at some point, true individuation demands the uncomfortable work of examining one's own contribution to a pattern, even when that pattern was set in motion primarily by another person's failures. The empath must eventually ask, not in guilt, but in honest inquiry, why did I stay as long as I did? What in my own history made silence feel safer than confrontation? Accommodation feels safer than boundary. Disappearance feels safer than demand. This is not a question designed to shift blame back onto the one who was already carrying so much. It is a question designed to ensure that the next chapter of life is not simply a repetition of the last one, wearing a different face. Jung warned repeatedly that what remains unconscious will be lived out as fate, that patterns not brought fully into awareness will simply recreate themselves in new relationships, new circumstances, new people who look nothing like the last one, but who will, eventually, ask the same unconscious question of you. How much of yourself will you erase to keep this peace? The quiet exit was the right ending to that particular story, but it is only the ending if the pattern beneath it is finally examined, named, and released, not merely escaped. Otherwise, the same architecture simply waits, patiently, for the next house to be built inside. Somewhere, right now, someone is sitting in the wreckage of your absence, replaying every version of events, except the one where they finally see themselves clearly. That is not your responsibility to repair. It never was, and Jung's entire body of work insists on this point again and again. You cannot individuate on another person's behalf. You cannot carry their unconsciousness for them indefinitely without eventually losing your own consciousness in the process. Your silence did not create their reckoning. It simply removed the last obstacle, preventing them from finally having to face it alone. And you, wherever you are in this sequence, however far along the alchemical path, however loud the threshold guardian's guilt still sounds in the quiet hours, you are not required to explain your leaving to anyone, least of all to the part of yourself still frightened that leaving without explanation makes you cruel. It does not. It makes you, finally, someone who no longer confuses self-erasure with love. It makes you twice born. It makes you a wounded healer whose wound has finally, mercifully, stopped bleeding outward into everyone else's benefit and started closing, slowly, on its own terms, in its own time. The gold does not appear before the blackening finishes its work, but it does appear. This is the promise embedded in every alchemical text Jung ever studied, and it is the promise embedded in your own silence, whether you can feel it yet or not. If this found you at the right moment, let it be known. Like this video, subscribe and return tomorrow, because the next chapter of this journey walks further into what happens after the wounded healer finally stops healing everyone but themselves and begins, for the first time, the long and necessary work of healing the one person they spent a lifetime forgetting to include.